Welcome to the Missouri State Emergency Management Agency's applicant briefing for the presidentially declared disasters designated as DR 4867 and DR 4872 under FEMA's Public Assistance Program. The information in this briefing is accurate as of June 1, 2025. The declaration for DR 4867 includes damages from severe storms, straight-line winds, tornadoes, and some flooding. The incident period was March 14th and 15th of 2025. Which means that all eligible damages must have occurred on or between these dates. The disaster declaration occurred on May 21, 2025. This declaration includes both public assistance and individual assistance for the listed counties. Please carefully review the list because several counties were declared only for one type of assistance. The declaration for DR 4872 includes damages from severe storms, straight-line winds, tornadoes, and some flooding. The incident period was March 30th through April 8th of 2025, which means that all eligible damages must have occurred on or between these dates. The disaster declaration occurred on May 21st, 2025. This disaster is currently declared only for the Public Assistance Program. This is FEMA's Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide version 5, which is applicable to all disasters declared after January 6th of 2025. This document can be found in FEMA's media library on their website through the link provided. This is SEMA's Public Assistance website. All active disaster declarations are listed at the bottom of this page. The specific details of each declaration are listed here. Applicants may reference this presentation on the page at any time during the disaster cycle. Other documentation resources are available for download from SEMA's Public Assistance page, including the state forms required to issue reimbursement payments to applicants for each event. This slide contains the team lead contact information for SEMA's Public Assistance Workgroup. Each county is color-coded to a specific team found on the map. Please contact the team that matches the color of your county. State agencies and all other multi-county statewide applicants are assigned to the green team. Rural electric cooperatives are assigned to the red team. Here are the topics we will cover in this presentation. In the first half of the briefing, we will begin with an overview of the public assistance process. We will discuss submission of the request for public assistance and usage of FEMA's grants portal. We will talk about the required state forms and how to complete them. We will talk about completing the UEI and the Missouri BIS registration processes. We will discuss how damages are identified and how projects are formulated. The end of Part 1 will include a discussion about grants management and management costs projects. The second half of the presentation will cover a general overview of the public assistance program and a discussion about eligibility, procurement and contracting, and appeals. Public assistance is a federal grant program that provides cost-share assistance to eligible applicants in a presidentially declared disaster. The federal share is not less than 75% of the eligible costs. The non-federal share, which is the remaining 25% of the eligible cost, is the responsibility of the applicant. The Public Assistance Program is a collaborative partnership between three entities, FEMA, SEMA, and the applicant. FEMA directs how the overall program functions, makes all determinations on eligibility, provides technical assistance with project development, approves all projects, and provides the grant funding. SEMA functions as the recipient for the PA program. SEMA manages the program, educates and supports the applicant in navigating the program, and monitors and reviews all awarded projects until they are completed by the applicants. The applicant is also known as the subrecipient. The applicant is responsible for reporting all damages, gathering documentation to support their costs, and completing the projects that have been approved by FEMA. This is the public assistance process. This briefing covers two separate disaster declarations with two separate incident periods. We received the presidential declarations on May 21st, 2025. This is the virtual applicant briefing presentation for both DR 4867 and DR 4872. The next step in the process following the applicant briefing is for each jurisdiction to submit their Federal Request for Public Assistance, or RPA. This submission has a deadline of 30 days after the declaration date, which was May 21st, 2025. RPAs will be due on or before June 20th of 2025. In addition to the federal RPA, the state of Missouri will supply additional required forms. These forms will be used for communicating with applicants and for the disbursement of payments. SEMA recommends submission of these completed forms within 60 days of the declaration date, as SEMA cannot process payments without them. These forms can be downloaded from the SEMA website or requested from your designated SEMA contacts. Some private nonprofit entities may be eligible for public assistance funding. Here are some examples of private nonprofit entities. Entities that provide critical services or a non-critical but essential service can be eligible. The owner or operator of a private nonprofit entity must submit the following with their RPA: a completed private nonprofit facility questionnaire, a current tax exemption status letter or letter from the state substantiating non-revenue producing nonprofit status, proof of ownership or legal responsibility, a list of services provided, their current insurance policy, and, if applicable, accreditation for educational facilities. If you are the owner of a nonprofit organization that provides critical or non-critical but essential services to the general public, you may be eligible for reimbursement of costs directly related to a particular disaster. FEMA provides disaster recovery funding through the Public Assistance Program only if no other federal program is responsible for funding the recovery. In the case of private nonprofits, the U.S. Small Business Administration may be able to provide funding in the aftermath of a major disaster declaration. For eligible private nonprofits that provide non-critical services, FEMA will only provide PA funding if an SBA loan will not cover the full recovery of the eligible facility. Before a non-critical private nonprofit can apply for public assistance, the owner or operator must apply for a loan with the Small Business Administration. If they are found ineligible or receive maximum funding through this source but still have eligible costs that are not covered, they may then apply for funding through FEMA. Now that we've covered the deadline for submission and what may be required for some applicants to participate in public assistance, we must discuss how the federal request for public assistance should be submitted. The submittal of the federal RPA can be accomplished in one of two ways: through Grants Portal or through the submission of a paper copy of the RPA. At this time, the preferred method of RPA submission is through FEMA's Grants Portal. Before submitting an RPA through Grants Portal, you'll need to set up an account if you have not already done so. For those applicants that have not participated in a disaster event since 2017, SEMA staff can enter or update your entity's information in Grants Portal. If you choose to submit a paper copy of the federal RPA, you can download the form on SEMA's website, complete it, and forward it to the email address provided. You will also need to complete a paper copy of the Applicant Impact Survey. Once SEMA has entered your RPA information, you will receive a notification email from Grants Portal with your login information and a request to change your password. Here is a screenshot of the Grants Portal website login. Grants Portal is a browser-based tool that you can use to upload documentation for viewing by FEMA and SEMA staff, track the progress of your project formulation by FEMA, and complete tasks related to project steps. Again, FEMA's Grants Portal can be found at grantee.fema.gov. Now that you've submitted your federal RPA, you must also submit documentation to SEMA for use and participation in the Public Assistance Program. State forms are used for making payments to applicants, and the remainder are compliance forms indicating that the applicant understands that they are required to follow federal and state laws during participation in the program. These forms officially name an authorized representative who will be required to sign all further documents related to this program. Registration in Missouri BIS and an active UEI registration are also required for reimbursement. This is a list of the state forms that have been included in the applicant briefing packet. We will review them over the next few slides. This is the State of Missouri Application for Federal State Public Assistance Form, also referred to as the PA2 form. This form collects all of the applicant's specific information and is used to issue payments. This form should be completed by the authorized representative for your jurisdiction. SEMA recommends that the authorized representative should be someone with decision-making and fiduciary responsibility for your jurisdiction. The authorized representative will also be the primary contact for the jurisdiction when SEMA must reach out to discuss the status of project work for the PA program. This is SEMA's Public Assistance Grant Certification Form. This is a set of 4 pages that include information and conditions of the Public Assistance Program. This form serves as a confirmation that the applicant has read and understands the programmatic information and names the authorized representative and alternate contacts. If the authorized representative is not available, we will attempt to contact one of the other listed contacts on this form. The senior elected official space is designated as a space for the highest ranking or elected official. The financial officer or alternate contact space is designated for the person who tracks finances for the applicant. This could be a county treasurer, a city clerk, or any other person that the applicant wishes to add. SEMA can add these individuals to Grants Portal at the applicant's request. This is the state's PA4 form, also called the Assurance of Compliance with 2 CFR 200.317 through 327. The purpose of this form is to inform the applicant of the federal procurement requirements that they must comply with as participants in the public assistance program. The next forms are the SF-424B and SF-424D. These are federal forms that cover expectations for applicants to follow all federal laws, statutes, and executive orders while participating in the federal grant program. This is the final required form in the state packet. It is the certification regarding lobbying form. Simply put, this form notifies the applicant that federal funding cannot be used for lobbying activities. Here are the steps the applicant must follow to obtain their Unique Entity Identifier, or UEI. SEMA can only provide limited assistance with this process, as this information is being submitted by the applicant directly to the federal government. Please note that once you've obtained your UEI registration, you must set your jurisdictional profile to active and publicly viewable for SEMA to be able to search sam.gov and verify your registration. As a reminder, your profile must be updated on a yearly basis to maintain active status. This is an image of the sam.gov webpage where the process to obtain the UEI number begins. As of May 2024, the state began its transition to Missouri Buys powered by movers. Until the transition is completed in the summer of 2025, all state of Missouri suppliers will need to be registered in both Missouri Buys and the new Missouri Buys powered by movers. Please note that if you are a current Missouri Buys supplier, you must still register under the new Missouri Buys powered by movers as a vendor. If you have trouble with registration, you should reach out to missouribuys.mo.gov for assistance. Applicants are not required to input their UEI numbers when registering in Missouri Buys or Movers. This can be added later. Applicants will receive an email to confirm registration. Forwarding this email to SEMA will notify us that registration has been completed. This should alleviate delays in the processing of project reimbursements. These instructions have been provided by the Office of Administration to provide direction on the Missouri Buys registration process. If you are not currently registered with Missouri Buys, you should follow Step 1 before moving on to Step 2. Step 2 is registering under Missouri Buys powered by movers. Once the RPA has been submitted, a FEMA representative referred to as a program delivery manager will contact each applicant to introduce themselves and set a date for the recovery scoping meeting. This first phone call is referred to as the exploratory call and provides FEMA with the opportunity to gather some initial information from the applicant. The recovery scoping meeting will be the first substantial meeting between FEMA and the applicant, which will allow an in-depth look at the applicant's damages and begin the process of gathering documentation related to costs and eligibility. FEMA will work with the applicant to develop a list of projects and begin scheduling future site inspections. The recovery scoping meeting is important because it starts the clock for the identification and submission of damages to FEMA by the applicant. The applicant has 60 days from the RSM to report all identified damages to FEMA. Applicants can request extensions to this deadline, but that extension must be submitted to SEMA as soon as possible. After the recovery scoping meeting has occurred, applicants will be asked to provide information for the damage inventory form, as well as any photos or documentation that support the damages. If the information provided is insufficient to begin writing a project, FEMA may schedule site inspections with the applicant to review damaged sites. Damages are typically grouped by the category of work, but FEMA may allow smaller groupings for projects based on logical divisions. At this stage, FEMA will begin to assess eligibility and may issue determination memos for ineligible damaged items. We will discuss determination memos near the end of this presentation. If the work appears to be eligible and the documentation is sufficient, particularly for completed project work, the information will be forwarded to FEMA's Consolidated Resource Center. CRC staff will begin formulating projects based on the information provided. Once the projects have been written, they will be reviewed by various FEMA sections such as hazard mitigation, insurance, and environmental planning and historic preservation, or EHP, to ensure that special conditions are identified. The projects will then be forwarded to SEMA and the applicant for review before returning to FEMA for final review and obligation. Once reviews are completed, FEMA will obligate the project. This means that the recovery funds for the project are set aside by FEMA and passed along to SEMA as the recipient to be distributed in accordance with administrative policy. The applicant is responsible for completing the project work in the manner approved by FEMA within the project report. If changes must be made to the project at any point, the applicant must contact SEMA. The minimum project size is $4,000, which means that if a project's total costs are less than this amount, no project will be written. This is true of all projects except donated resource and management cost projects. A project is considered small if the cost falls on or between $4,000 and $1,062,900. Projects that are over that $1,062,900 amount will be considered large projects under FEMA policy. Small projects may be reimbursed based on actual cost if they are known, but typically will be reimbursed upon project obligation based on the estimate approved by FEMA. The Public Assistance Program presumes that if an applicant has an underrun on a small project, that any excess funds will be used to cover overruns on other small projects. However, if an applicant experiences a significant overrun on the total of their small projects, the applicant may request additional funding through the net small project overrun process. The applicant must notify SEMA if a net small project overrun is expected. Donated resource and management cost projects are not part of the overrun request. A large project is reimbursed based on actual documented costs. Donated resources and management cost projects are also based on actual costs regardless of their size. Partial payment requests may be submitted by the applicant for work completed prior to the project completion. This requires the submission of eligible cost documentation that will be validated by SEMA. Any questions on eligibility may result in a delay in payment until FEMA can assess the eligibility at closeout. Now we're going to discuss a few grant management items that applicants should be aware of as they proceed through the program. The first item is work completion deadlines, which can sometimes be referred to as the period of performance deadline. The period of performance is the work period for the obligated project. For emergency work projects, which are Category A and B projects, the deadline to complete the obligated project is 6 months from the declaration date. For permanent work projects, the deadline to complete the obligated project is 18 months from the declaration date. Category I projects, a new project type under Papa G5, have a 180-day deadline from the declaration date. All work completed between the beginning of the incident period and the declaration date is generally considered eligible once the declaration is approved and is not counted against the period of performance for projects. If more time is needed, the applicant may submit a request through SEMA to extend the period of performance on their projects. The extension request must include a detailed justification and documentation that explains why the project completion has been delayed, the current status of the work, and the expected completion date of the project. SEMA has the authority to approve some extensions. Emergency work projects can be extended for 6 months, and permanent work projects can be extended up to an additional 30 months. Any extensions beyond these timeframes must be approved by FEMA. Category I projects cannot be extended beyond the initial 180-day deadline. While projects are still in progress, applicants are required to respond to requests for quarterly reports and provide information requested by FEMA on all open projects. SEMA will send the quarterly report to applicants about 30 days prior to their due date to FEMA. The quarterly report asks for information on all open projects, including the total funds spent to date, the status of the project, if the project is complete, what the projected completion date is, and any recent development that could delay the project. SEMA will report this data to FEMA, but this is also an opportunity to check in with applicants and obtain extension requests as needed. The state of Missouri has guidelines for document retention for participants in grant programs. Per the requirements of SEMA's administrative plan and the FEMA state agreement, applicants who participate in the public assistance program are directed to maintain all documentation related to disaster recovery projects for a minimum of 5 years beyond the final period of performance date of the disaster. SEMA will issue a notification when the disaster closes to all applicants, and this notification will start the clock for document retention. Documentation must be retained for audits and compliance reviews. The primary reason why an applicant must retain their documentation is the single audit requirement. If an applicant expends $1 million or more in federal funds during its fiscal year, the applicant must perform a single or program-specific audit. This includes funding from any and all federal grants or programs. SEMA can also perform periodic reviews with an applicant to verify that the applicant maintains compliance with all state and federal laws. It is important to remember that even if a project has been reviewed and deemed eligible by FEMA representatives, a federal auditor could disagree with their eligibility findings and require the return of federal funds that have been paid to the applicant. The next 2 slides of this briefing contain information regarding the interim policy for management costs. Management costs are written as a separate project called a Category Z project. The Category Z projects will be formulated by FEMA after all other projects have been obligated. Category Z projects have a reimbursement cap equal to 5% of the applicant's total award amount. The total award amount is the sum total of all project obligations, excluding donated resources projects and the management cost project itself. Applicants must certify their management activities through provided documentation. Category Z projects are validated based on actual cost documentation in the same manner that large projects are validated. Applicants must provide information including dates worked, hours worked, what project the administrative person was working on, and timesheets to verify days and hours worked against the project. If you are not already tracking this information, you should begin right away and make every effort to capture project management costs prior to today's date. Attendance to the applicant briefing is considered an eligible Category Z cost. Management costs associated with an appeal that is ultimately denied are not eligible. Management costs can be claimed for up to 180 days following the completion of the final non-management cost project. And now Part 2 of the DR 4867 and DR 4872 applicant briefing, the Public Assistance Program overview. In order for work to be eligible for recovery under the Public Assistance Program, the work must be required as a result of the declared incident, be located in the designated area, be the legal responsibility of the applicant, and be undertaken at a reasonable cost. But what happens when an applicant is legally responsible for facilities across multiple counties? State agencies operate in every county. Rural electric cooperatives operate in multiple counties. We must follow the guidance listed here to determine what is eligible. If a county did not meet their eligibility threshold for the declaration, any damages caused by the storm event within that county will not be eligible for reimbursement through a disaster declaration. This is why it is critical for all applicants to report damages to SEMA for preliminary damage assessments, even if an applicant may decide not to participate moving forward. Eligibility for the Public Assistance Program encompasses 4 components referred to as the eligibility pyramid. At the foundation is applicant eligibility, followed by facility eligibility, then eligible work, and finally eligible cost. Determinations of eligibility are made in this order. There are 2 types of applicants that may apply to the PA program: either state and local tribal nations and territorial entities, or private nonprofit organizations, which can include houses of worship and other faith-based organizations. For facility eligibility, the definition of facility is any publicly or privately owned building, works, system, or equipment built or manufactured, or any improved and maintained natural feature. This list provides examples of what the Public Assistance Program considers to be facilities. Examples include flood control systems, buildings, non-federal aid roadways, airports, parks, and other public facilities such as pumping stations, vehicles, fences, and ditches. Some facilities may be ineligible if they were inactive or partially inactive when the disaster incident occurred. If the facility is only temporarily inactive, is under construction, or is designated for use in the near future, then that facility may be considered eligible for recovery through public assistance. FEMA provides grant funding through the Public Assistance Program for debris removal, emergency protective measures, permanent restoration of damaged facilities, and building code and floodplain management administration and enforcement activities. A standard public assistance project will fall under one of 2 classifications: emergency work or permanent work. These are the 8 categories of permanent work projects. As previously discussed, there is a 9th category for management costs. An emergency work project is a project written for actions taken to save lives, protect public health and safety, protect improved property, and/or eliminate or lessen the immediate threat of additional damages. The deadline to complete emergency work projects is 6 months after the declaration date, which would be November 17, 2025. Category A projects are for debris removal. Debris removal activities include clearance, removal, and disposal. Please contact SEMA to discuss debris removal from private property, which will require written permission from FEMA. Debris on private property can be moved to the jurisdictional right-of-way to be removed by an applicant. Applicants may opt in for straight-time labor costs on debris removal projects. Debris can be removed from waterways, such as near support pillars of a bridge, if the removal will help clear obstructions to water flow and prevent potential damages to other facilities. Category B projects are those written for emergency protective measures. In general, emergency protective measures are those actions taken before, during, and immediately after a disaster event that are necessary to save lives and protect public health and safety. This can include flood fighting measures such as sandbagging, operating an emergency operations center, and making emergency repairs to facilities. Any work that is considered temporary rather than permanent falls into this category of work. Temporary costs can include costs for placement as well as removal, such as temporary gravel roads or emergency levees. Permanent work projects are written to restore a facility to pre-disaster design and function. Pre-disaster means the day before the disaster incident period. The deadline to complete permanent work projects is 18 months from the declaration date, which will be November 17, 2026. This applies to Category C through G projects. FEMA has added an 8th project type under the Public Assistance Program. After a disaster, recovering communities face an increase of administrative and enforcement work to ensure that repair and replacement of damaged facilities and infrastructure meet adopted regulatory requirements. Category I projects cover building code administration, code enforcement, floodplain management ordinance and enforcement, and substantial damage determinations. Please be aware that these projects are only written to cover costs within the first 180 days following the disaster declaration and cannot be extended. Also, like Category B projects, only overtime is eligible for the budgeted labor. Straight time is only eligible for unbudgeted labor, such as temporary employees. Please see pages 224 through 229 of the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide version 5 for more details. In some circumstances, repairs or new construction may trigger upgrades to facilities as required by codes and standards. Upgrades that are required by codes and standards are only eligible if they apply to the type of restoration required, are appropriate to the pre-disaster use of the facility, are reasonable, in writing, formally adopted and implemented by the applicant on or before the declaration date, or are a legal federal requirement, applied uniformly, and were enforced during the time it was in effect. The applicant may be required to provide documentation to support eligibility of code and standard upgrades. The Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018, otherwise referred to as DARA, amended the Stafford Act for FEMA to require applicants to incorporate specific codes, specifications, and standards in accordance with FEMA Recovery Interim Policy FP 104-009-11. Appendix A of this interim policy provides a list of consensus-based codes, specifications, and standards. It is the applicant's responsibility to identify and apply these codes and standards for each project. FEMA looks for opportunities to provide PA funding through Section 406 of the Stafford Act. Section 406's hazard mitigation is applied through the Public Assistance Program. Hazard mitigation is a sustained action taken to reduce or eliminate long-term risks to people and property from natural hazards and their effects. If you have ideas about hazard mitigation efforts that can be applied to your projects, please notify your program delivery manager during your recovery scoping meeting. For permanent work projects, FEMA must determine whether a facility should be repaired or replaced. In general, a facility is considered repairable if the cost will not exceed 50% of the cost to replace the facility. There may also be circumstances where a facility that must be replaced might be relocated as part of a replacement project. After FEMA obligates a project, an applicant is expected to follow the written scope of work to complete the recovery process. However, an applicant may identify a need to change the scope of work. If this happens, the applicant must contact SEMA as soon as possible to discuss making the request to change the scope of work. This should be done before any work is completed that would constitute a change to the project. Failing to obtain approved change of scope of work could jeopardize the applicant's PA funding. A change in scope of work request should include a detailed justification and documentation to support the eligibility of the requested revision. If the request includes previously unreported or unidentified damages, the applicant must provide documentation that establishes that the damages are the result of the declared disaster event. Here are 5 reasons why a change in scope of work could be approved as eligible. These reasons include alternate repair methods that are more cost-effective than the original proposed repair method, a repair method that is not technically feasible, an increase in approved quantities due to errors and omissions, previously unknown or hidden disaster-related damages discovered during recovery repairs, and finally, an applicant's request for an improved or alternate project. FEMA offers 3 options that provide flexibility for the applicant to use public assistance funding for purposes other than restoring a facility to pre-disaster design and function. The options are known as capped projects. A capped project is a project that cannot exceed a specified amount based on program criteria. The first 2 types of capped projects are improved and alternate projects. An improved project is a project where the applicant wants to make additions or improvements to the existing recovery project at the applicant's expense. For the improved projects, the funding is capped at the estimated cost to return a facility to pre-disaster condition. An alternate project may be requested when an applicant wishes to apply recovery funding designated for the repair of a damaged facility to a separate facility that serves the same jurisdiction, because repairing the damaged facility will not benefit the general public. The third type of capped project is the alternate procedures for large projects. When applicants meet with their program delivery managers to discuss their large projects, they may be asked if they wish to choose a fixed cost estimate project. FEMA will work with the applicant to develop a fixed cost estimate. The applicant will have the option to accept or decline the fixed cost estimate. If the applicant declines the fixed cost estimate, the project will be developed through normal public assistance processes. The fixed cost projects offer applicants flexibility in how they pursue the recovery work by allowing the applicant to pursue recovery efforts with no requirement to rebuild communities back to what existed prior to the disaster. The alternative procedures fixed cost estimate will incorporate applicable codes and standards and proposed hazard mitigation measures. Applicants must opt in prior to obligation. Alternative procedures are only for large projects, and the project requires a credible cost estimate and FEMA approval. The goal is to support efficient and innovative resilient recovery outcomes. As a condition of receiving federal funding for the replacement or repair of a permanent facility, applicants are required to obtain and maintain insurance to protect the facility against future loss. The property must be considered insurable and must be insured with the types and extent of insurance reasonably available, adequate, and necessary for the property. If an applicant does not obtain and maintain insurance on a facility, FEMA will deny or deobligate funding in an amount equal to the required amount of insurance coverage. FEMA is legally prohibited from duplicating benefits from other sources. FEMA cannot provide disaster recovery funding for a facility that would otherwise be covered by another federal agency. FEMA also cannot provide funding that would duplicate insurance proceeds. Funding from other sources, such as community development block grants, may only be used towards the non-federal cost share or PA ineligible work. If damages have been caused or increased by a third party, the applicant must make an attempt to recover costs from the third party. The applicant is responsible for complying with applicable federal and state EHP laws. In addition to identifying compliance requirements, FEMA will seek opportunities to incorporate conservation measures into the project. Appendix D in the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide provides a list of frequently encountered EHP statutes, executive orders, and regulations. Cost eligibility is the final component of the eligibility pyramid. However, even if all other eligibility criteria have been met, an incurred cost is not always eligible. The cost must be tied directly to the eligible work, and they must be adequately documented. Costs must be reduced as necessary by applicable credits such as salvage or insurance proceeds. Applicants will maintain eligibility of costs by following all applicable legal regulations as well as their uniformly applied internal cost practices, such as contract bidding. Finally, the work must be necessary and reasonable to complete the work and return the facility to pre-disaster condition. All determinations on the reasonableness of cost will be made by FEMA. A cost is reasonable if, in its nature and amount, it does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time the applicant makes the decision to incur the cost. It is extremely important that the applicant understand how FEMA evaluates the reasonableness of costs and pays particular attention to ensuring that they follow ethical business practices. For example, the procurement of contracting to perform work must not include parties with a financial interest in the applicant's operations, such as a familial relation of a board member. Comprehensive record keeping is critical to proving cost eligibility. Develop a plan for keeping track of such things as hours worked and by whom, pay and benefit rates, contracts, and invoices and proofs of payment. It is also recommended that applicants keep track of donated labor and equipment and materials as they may be reimbursable towards the non-federal share of eligible work projects. FEMA will typically request a completed fringe benefit worksheet from applicants to include any or all of the fringe benefits listed here as eligible costs in addition to basic labor wages. Applicants are encouraged to have a written personnel policy that defines the nature of overtime pay versus compensatory time, but that policy must be uniformly applied at all times and cannot contain a contingency clause related to federal funding. As a reminder, emergency protective measures projects will only reimburse an applicant for overtime hours, as in normal work hours would be considered a standard expense based on the requirements of the job performed. For example, a law enforcement officer working their normal schedule during a disaster incident period would not be reimbursed to the applicant as an eligible cost, but if that officer is required to work overtime during the disaster event, those overtime hours can be claimed as an eligible cost as defined by the applicant's personnel policy. Version 5 of the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide includes new language regarding applicant force account labor. Current employees are called budgeted employees, and temporary, reassigned, part-time, or seasonal employees are labeled as unbudgeted employees. Here we provide the definitions for reassigned employees and unbudgeted employees and their eligibility for pay. Unbudgeted employees are eligible for straight time and overtime on eligible emergency work projects. In addition to the labor cost eligibility, FEMA provides PA funding for the operation of equipment owned or purchased by the applicant. This cost is typically calculated with an established hourly rate, but some equipment is rate based on mileage. An applicant may also purchase equipment if needed to effectively respond to an incident. If justifiable, FEMA provides PA funding for both the purchase price and the equipment usage based on the cost codes or the actual fuel and maintenance costs. These costs are calculated based on the number of hours the applicant utilized the equipment as compared to their labor hours. As a reminder, the applicant must adequately document these costs by the appropriate rate in order to be reimbursed for eligible costs and work. FEMA has published a schedule of equipment rates that is applicable on a national basis. This schedule is current as of July 26, 2023, is applicable to these disasters, and can be found at the link provided. In some cases, states, tribal nations, or territories will have rates that have been established for equipment usage. For STT applicants, FEMA provides PA funding up to $75 per hour. An applicant may have established local rates for use under local government guidelines. If this is true, FEMA will provide PA funding for equipment usage based on the lower of the local rate or the FEMA rate. If there is no established rate for a piece of equipment, applicants may submit a rate or request that FEMA provide a rate. For the cost eligibility of rented or leased equipment, FEMA will reimburse based on the terms of the contract. The applicant should be sure to follow their procurement policy and seek a reasonable price for the terms of the agreement. FEMA will compare the cost of purchasing and maintaining a piece of equipment versus the cost of rental or leasing when determining the cost eligibility for reimbursement. As with other eligible costs, the actual cost for supplies or materials will be used for the project worksheet's cost estimate whenever possible. If the materials were taken from the applicant's stock, the reimbursement will be based on the applicant's purchasing invoices or local vendor estimates. Adequate and accurate documentation will help the applicant maintain their best eligibility of costs. Applicants must track items from stock with inventory records. FEMA allows applicants to use the value of donated resources to offset the non-federal cost share of its eligible emergency work projects and direct federal assistance. What is a donated resource? It is a non-cash contribution, property, or service related to eligible recovery work. Members of the community, whether individual citizens or other groups, may donate labor, equipment, or materials towards the completion of eligible work. The applicant should record the labor and equipment time and material values in a manner similar to the documentation of eligible work. These costs can be used to offset the cost of the non-federal share of applicable projects. The offset for donated resources can only be applied if all of these criteria are met. The donation must be from a third party that is not the applicant or a member of a governmental entity. The resource is necessary and reasonable to accomplishing the project. The applicant uses the resource to complete the project within the approved period of performance. And finally, the applicant adequately documents the resource and work performed, including description, specific locations, and time worked. This section of the briefing covers the various statutory requirements for procurement and contracting. I will read the text verbatim because the procurement is an important issue with serious eligibility considerations. FEMA provides PA funding for contract costs based on the terms of the contract or the purchase agreement if an applicant meets federal procurement and contracting requirements. Federal procurement and contracting requirements for state and territorial government agencies and tribal nations are different from those for local government agencies and private nonprofits. If an applicant does not comply with federal procurement requirements, FEMA applies an appropriate remedy in accordance with its authorities. FEMA has determined an appropriate remedy under these circumstances is to either deny all costs associated with the contract or, if sufficient information is provided to substantiate a reasonable amount for the eligible work completed, FEMA only reimburses the portion of the cost it determines are reasonable and allowable based on all available information and documentation provided. Local governments and private nonprofits must comply with their own documented procurement procedures, applicable SLTT government laws and regulations, and applicable federal laws and regulations. If there is a conflict among these procurement rules and procedures, the local government or private nonprofit must use the more restrictive requirement. FEMA encourages local governments and private nonprofits to establish or update written procedures that reflect applicable SLTT laws and regulations and maintain required written standards of conduct covering conflicts of interest and governing the performance of employees who engage in the selection, award, and administration of contracts. Local governments and private nonprofits should also create a pre-qualified list of responsible contractors identified to possess the qualifications and technical abilities to satisfy the applicant's potential requirements. Although not a contract, many entities have pre-qualified lists that serve as contract research. A pre-qualified contractor is one that the applicant has evaluated and determined to be qualified to perform the work based on the capabilities such as technical and management skills, prior experience, past performance, and availability. A pre-qualified contractor is not entitled to a standby contract. Applicants must still conduct full and open competition. The applicant cannot exclude potential bidders or offerers from qualifying during the solicitation period, even if they were not on the pre-qualified list. These next 3 slides contain the referenced procurement requirements that an applicant must be aware of when seeking to contract under public assistance projects. Federal procurement requirements for tribal and local governments and private nonprofits are found at 2 CFR 200.318 through 200.327. The requirements include, but are not limited to, providing full and open competition, evaluating and documenting the contractor's integrity, compliance with public policy, record of past performance, and financial and technical resources, ensuring that the contractor was not suspended or debarred, excluding contractors that develop or draft specifications, requirements, statements of work, or invitations for bids or requests for proposals from competing for such procurements to ensure objective contractor performance and eliminate unfair competitive advantage. Performing a cost and price analysis in connection with every procurement action above the simplified acquisition threshold, including contract modifications. Applicants must make independent estimates before receiving bids or proposals. Maintaining records to detail the history of the procurement, including but are not limited to the rationale for the method of procurement, the selection of the contract type, the contractor selection or rejection, and the basis for the contract price. And lastly, conducting the following steps to ensure the use of small and minority businesses, women's business enterprises, veteran-owned businesses, and labor surplus area firms where possible. Place such organizations that are qualified on solicitation lists. Ensure such organizations are solicited whenever they are potential sources. Divide total requirements when economically feasible into smaller tasks or quantities. Establish delivery schedules where the requirement permits, encouraging its participation. Use the services and assistance as appropriate of the U.S. Small Business Administration and the Minority Business Development Agency of the Department of Commerce, and require prime contractors to conduct the above steps if subcontracting. In addition to these rules, the applicant must maintain oversight of contractor performance in accordance with their contract terms, conditions, and specifications. These are the 5 generally acceptable procurement methods. They are micro-purchase, small purchase procedure, sealed bids, competitive proposals, and non-competitive proposals. Non-competitive proposals are also referred to as sole sourcing. Non-competitive procurement has limitations in federal grant programs. One or more of the stipulations listed here must be met in order for a non-competitive procurement to be considered eligible by FEMA. As always, the applicant must provide documentation of the justification for the use of a non-competitive procurement. As noted on the previous slide, one of the justifications for a non-competitive procurement is an exigent or emergency circumstance. But what does FEMA define as an exigent or emergency circumstance? Exigency is the existence of a need to avoid, prevent, or alleviate serious harm or injury, financial or otherwise, to the applicant. An emergency is the existence of a threat to life, public health or safety, or improved property requiring immediate action to alleviate the threat. You will note that this is the same language used to describe emergency work projects. In summary, exigency applies to the applicant's position as the legally responsible party, whereas emergency applies to the potential impact to the general public. Now that we have defined exigency versus emergency, we must discuss how these apply to procurement. FEMA has issued recent determinations of ineligibility regarding the justification of exigent or emergency circumstances for contracting. These determinations have stated that if an applicant has time to reasonably bid the contract, then the awarding of the contract cannot be issued under exigent or emergency circumstances. Based on SEMA's recent experience with this issue, an exigent or emergency circumstance primarily occurs within the immediate aftermath of the event when there is a critical need to repair damages quickly. The applicant is advised to pursue proper procurement if the work will continue for an extended period of time. For procurement purposes, the Davis-Bacon Act does not apply to state and local contracts for work completed using public assistance funds under the Stafford Act. This is likely because the work is performed by the state and local applicants who are then reimbursed through the public assistance program. This also means that Missouri's prevailing wage laws do apply for procurements for FEMA projects. If you have questions about the applicability of Missouri's prevailing wage rules, please contact the Missouri Department of Labor and Industrial Relations at the number shown here. As stated in other sections of this briefing, Applicants are required to compile and retain documentation of all costs incurred for their projects, especially contracted cost. The applicant will be expected to submit the listed items, if applicable, upon request by either SEMA or FEMA. In this final section, we're going to discuss what happens when FEMA questions eligibility. As FEMA evaluates eligibility, applicants may receive a request for information. Applicants are required to provide supporting documentation that proves their eligibility. If the applicant or any part of the project are found to be ineligible, FEMA will issue a determination of eligibility or a determination memo. This letter will provide an explanation of the ineligible elements and the law or statute under which it is determined. An applicant may receive a partial determination of eligibility, meaning that some costs are eligible but some are not. The determination memo will also inform the applicants of their right of appeal and the procedures to follow to submit an appeal. Examples of items that may result in determination memos include the denial of the request for public assistance, denials of time extensions, and ineligible scope of work costs. If an applicant disagrees with FEMA's determination, they will be provided the opportunity to appeal the decision by providing additional documentation or information that disputes the determination. Please notify SEMA of your intent to appeal a determination memo as soon as possible. The appeal must be submitted by the applicant to SEMA within 60 days of the issuance of the determination memoranda by FEMA. Determinations of ineligibility will be issued to the applicants through FEMA's Grants Portal. Grants Portal should send notifications to contact emails associated with the jurisdiction as soon as the determination memo has been applied. SEMA will make every effort to contact the applicant and notify them that a determination has been issued and to discuss the applicant's options for appeal. SEMA must forward the applicant's appeal to FEMA within 120 days of the date of the determination memo was issued to the applicant. SEMA must provide an eligibility recommendation based on the review of the Public Assistance Program and policy and all other applicable laws, and then forward that request to FEMA's regional administrator for a decision. FEMA is the sole arbiter of eligibility for the Public Assistance Program. SEMA has no authority to make eligibility determinations. These guidelines apply to both first and second appeals, as well as the arbitration process, which is an option available in place of a second appeal. Under the Section 423 appeal rules, applicants may have the opportunity to choose arbitration in lieu of a second appeal. To request arbitration of a determination, the applicant must be part of a disaster declaration that occurred in 2016 or beyond. They must also have a disputed amount that either exceeds $500,000 or $100,000 if they are considered a rural community. The applicant must have filed the appropriate first appeal per the rules set forth in 44 CFR. And lastly, FEMA must have denied the first appeal or failed to issue a decision within 180 days of receiving the appeal. Applicants should compose their appeal submission in writing, and it should include the following information: all documentation supporting the applicant's position, the specific amount in dispute, especially if it's only a portion of the denied costs are being appealed by the applicant, and the specific provision in law or regulation that the applicant believes FEMA did not consistently apply. Applicants should be thorough in the first appeal submission, as they may not be able to add documentation on second appeal unless FEMA issues a request for information. Under the current appeal guidelines, applicants must request and submit their appeals electronically through Grants Portal. Determination memos will be issued by FEMA directly through Grants Portal and can be found under your organizational information in the applicant event profile for the specific disaster or under the project which the DM has been issued. DMs will appear in one of these two locations identified on the screen. Determination memos will be issued by FEMA directly through Grants Portal and can be found under your organizational information in the applicant event profile for the specific disaster or under the project which the DM has been issued. DMs will appear in one of these two locations identified on the screen. Slide 95. These final two slides are a list of SEMA recommendations for applicants that are participating in the Public Assistance Program. Document everything you do and retain those documents for a minimum of 5 years beyond the completion of your recovery projects. Organize your documentation by project. Be sure to review all invoices prior to payment and submission to SEMA. Some incurred costs may not be eligible under PA program rules. Document your completed work with photographs for closeout submission. Follow the contracting and procurement standards presented here. Identify opportunities for permitting, EHP, and codes and standards upgrades. Maintain regular communications with SEMA and FEMA throughout the process. Please contact SEMA if you have any questions about projects or the public assistance process. If you need to make a change to the project or request an extension, contact SEMA immediately. And finally, contact SEMA when projects are completed to begin the final cost reviews for reimbursements and closeouts. This concludes the applicant briefing for DR 4867 and DR 4872. As a reminder, if you are involved in both disaster events, you must submit a request for public assistance for both events. Please submit that request for public assistance to the grants portal as soon as possible. Contact your SEMA representatives for assistance if necessary. Thank you for viewing.